The Christian Science churches in the Tri-Counties present God and Health, inspirational talk by Rob Gilbert. Welcome. Inspirational speaker Rob Gilbert says that healing is just a thought away. Learn more about the power of God, the divine mind, to change thought and restore the body. Gilbert is a Christian Science practitioner and teacher, and a member of the Christian Science Board of Lectureship. For more information on the Christian Science churches in the Tri-Counties, visit our website at www.prayerthatheals.org.
In the area of mind-body research, did anybody see the special on television on antidepressants? It was on the television program 60 Minutes. Yeah. A medical researcher from Harvard Medical School said that antidepressants are little more effective than placebos. In essence, they're placebos. A common response was, "Do you mean to tell me that those meds, in all the years I've been using them, haven't helped me?" And the answer was so interesting. The answer was, "Oh, you were helped all right. You were helped. But it wasn't in the pill. It was in your thought. That's where the help came from." And they even said that the doctor's visit with the patient was part of the placebo effect. I think there's enough positive research going on that's raising questions, fundamental questions that have the potential of directing and redirecting modern healthcare. I think it's the success in a movement like Mind and Body that is also turning a good, sustained look at the effect of prayer on health, And some researchers are devoting themselves full-time to this research. And to me, it's much more than just an intellectual wrestling over medical theory. There's a spiritual awakening going on in this country. And some of these researchers are bringing a conviction to their research born of experience. They've been healed. They don't know how. They would like to know how, but they know they were healed. And that's impelling their research. Well, as I look over these kinds of experiments and results and the questions that they raise, I can't help but see parallels of the same kinds of things that brought Mary Baker Eddy to the discovery of that healing system that she called Christian Science. It's amazing when you look at what's going on today and the same kinds of research and testing and questioning that moved her in the same direction. For the first 45 years of her life, because of poor health, she was looking into anything that held out hope. And ultimately, all of them proved to be a failure. But along the way, she was learning important things about the effect of thought on the body. For instance, for a while, she practiced something called homeopathy. And that was a system where you would take a compound that was prescribed to a sick person, and then you would water it down, and you'd water it down, and you'd water it down until there wasn't anything of the original compound left. And then you shook it up a lot, and you gave that to the patient, and it cured them. Now, what this did to Eddy's thought was the focus of disease and healing is in the human mind. In those days, she believed that the cause of disease was not only in the human mind, but somehow or other through faith in God, that the healing was in the human mind. But what transitioned her from the human mind being a healer to God, the divine mind, was a life-changing event. In a moment of profound inspiration, she was healed of a severe malady. And it absolutely changed the direction of her life. She wrote about that experience in her book, Miscellaneous Writings. She said, "That short experience included a glimpse of the great fact that I have since tried to make plain to others, namely, life in and of spirit, this life being the sole reality of existence." In a moment of profound inspiration, she had glimpsed that she and all of us were spiritual beings, right here, right now. Perfect children of a loving God. When it comes to the love, she at times said it was unutterable. She just didn't have the words to describe it. And even though this revelation came from outside and above the material sense of things, she never talked about it as otherworldly. It was very real. It was very tangible. It wasn't another world. It was the only world. Life in and of spirit, this being the sole reality of existence. Well, there definitely was a connection between God and health. She was healed of that malady. But she didn't know how. She said that she had a life-changing experience, a mountaintop experience, and she didn't know how she got there. But along the way, it began to dawn on her that as she turned to this healing vision about the nature of God and the nature of His child, held in perfection by God's love, that she realized she was turning away from the material sense of things, filling her consciousness with the power and presence of God's love. And as she did that, it destroyed the fear and the consciousness of disease, and she would be healed. In that way, she learned how to heal others, and she learned how to teach others how to heal. Now, before this, she had some success as a healer. But after this experience, she was a tremendous healer. A few months after her experience, she was walking on the beach, and there was a little boy, 7 years old, named George Norton. And he was sitting on a pillow, and he had a shawl draped over his feet. And she wondered why he wasn't playing with the other boys and girls. So she walked over to him, and she asked him. And he said that he was born with double-clubbed feet, and he had never walked. And she pulled back the shawl, and she looked at the condition of his feet and ankles. And then she said, "You can walk." And he said, "No, I can't." He said, "You can walk." And she got behind him, and she picked him up under his arms, and she put her feet by his feet. And then she started to guide him, to get him to start to try to walk. And he's protesting, "I can't, I can't." And then after a while, he stops protesting, and he begins to walk. And his feet and ankle bones are straightened out. And when his mother came back, she was up hitching the wagon and getting some water. When she came back to see her child walking for the first time in his life, she went up to the woman, and they both looked at one another, tear-filled eyes, so grateful for what God had done. When I was going to graduate school in the Boston area years and years ago, there was a woman that lived there. Her name was Mrs. Bowles. She was in her mid-90s, and I never met her, but I wish I had. She was born blind. And she said that she and her mother lived in the poor section of Boston in those early days, and that when she was a little girl, her mother was a seamstress and would take her to the local Baptist church where her mother would do sewing projects for the wealthy ladies. And she would sit over in the corner and occupy herself for hours until her mother was through, and then they would walk home together. She said, one day, Mary Baker Eddy walked in, and she didn't know why, whether she had business with the minister or what, but she came over and she said, she talked to me. And she asked me if I knew the two great prayers, David's prayer and the Lord's Prayer. David's prayer being the 23rd Psalm. And then she recited them to me. And then she asked me to remember and to memorize those two prayers. And then she said the next day the same thing happened. Eddie came in, saw her over in the corner, walked over to her, and began to talk to her about those two great prayers. And then Mrs. Bowles said, I felt an overwhelming love. And she said, in all these years, that love has never left me. And she said that evening as she was walking home with her mom, she saw for the first time in her life, and that healing was permanent. Powerful healer. Powerful healer. To me, she wasn't just healing to heal, as important as that is. I think she was actually exploring that spiritual reality that she had glimpsed at the revelation of what she called Christian Science. Through her healing work, she was exploring that spiritual reality, the height, the depth, and the breadth of it, and its impact on human experience. And I think as the evidence mounted up in her healing work, I think it had the same effect on her as the discoveries in modern physics has had on the notion of a universe made up of hard matter and run by material laws. You know, physicists have found more recently that matter is not what it appears to be. It's actually a bunch of swirling forces moving so fast that it gives the illusion to the limited material senses that it is hard, but it's not. It's only the way the limited material senses perceives what's there. And in the same way, they found that there is an intimate connection between the observer and that event that's being observed. What does that mean? Well, for years it was believed that the universe is just made up of matter run by material laws like a giant engine, and that your thoughts and feelings are inconsequential. No connection at all. The human mind is just along for the ride. But now they're finding that there is a connection between the observer, human consciousness, and the material event that seems to be going on. Well, in Eddy's healing work, the more and more she learned through her healing work, she came to the conclusion that the material sense of the universe is not what it appears to be. Actually, it's the way the human mind radically distorts. It's the way the human mind radically distorts through the limited material senses what's really there. It's the way the human mind experiences its own belief systems, its own beliefs in substance and power and cause and effect. It's not God's universe. That actually underneath that material sense of things is a concrete spiritual reality, the same reality that she had glimpsed. And that there are not two universes, a material one and a spiritual one. There's only one, and it's spiritual. And what appears to be the material universe is a material sense of things, radically distorting what's there. And as far as a connection between, say, the human mind and body, she found there isn't just a connection. They're different forms of the same stuff. And as spiritual understanding changes human beliefs, it actually doesn't just make you feel better, it changes the action of those beliefs on the body. And there's a transformation. Well, she wrote down her discovery in her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And immediately, because of the thought shift that these ideas produced in human consciousness, there was healing. In the last chapter, 100 pages of healing after healing after healing of people that just read the book. Such thought-shifting ideas. And Jesus, the life work, the teachings, the healings of Christ Jesus came into a whole different light. To her, Jesus was the concrete evidence of spiritual reality. Jesus was the concrete evidence of spiritual reality breaking in on human history. Healing broken lives. And Jesus referred to this spiritual reality, the same reality that she had glimpsed. Jesus referred to this spiritual reality as the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And he said, it doesn't come with observation. You know, the material sense, well, it's over here, it's over there. He said, it's within you. That's where Mary Baker Eddy found it. Within her, a revelation. This spiritual awakening to her was the Christ, the healing Christ. The same Christ so fully brought to humanity by Christ Jesus, but always here to heal and save. The healing Christ. When the subject of God comes up in the discussion of health care, it's felt that you can no longer talk about a consistent healing power that can be understood and practiced. And that's because that the subject of God to some people carries a lot of negative baggage. For instance, if you're ill and you're praying to be healed, and you believe that the universe is poisoned with sin and condemned by an angry God, the guilt and the fear that this brings up are hardly the qualities you want when you're looking for health. And I've found that we really need a better understanding of God when it comes to our search for spiritual healing. And this was the case with a friend of mine. She said that she was raised to believe that God knew your every thought and could pull the rug out from underneath you at any moment when those thoughts weren't right. That God actually manipulated material events to bring about disease and accidents to teach us lessons. She said that one day she was talking to an acquaintance and told this friend that both of her children were diagnosed with 2 serious medical conditions. And she said she was rather surprised to hear her friend say, you know, Jesus' healings are still going on. She thought, well, not for me, I'm a backslider. But the friend got her a copy of the book Science and Health, and she began to read. She said the first effect of reading that book was hope, She said that instead of God sending disease and accidents to punish her or her children because of her sins, she learned that when those things seemed to happen, you could turn to a loving God and to be healed. She said in those days she used to cry a lot. And she didn't know why then. But she said today she feels that they were tears of gratitude, because instead of being born into sin and condemned by an angry God, that she was instead the beloved daughter of God, cherished, cared for. And she said the great thing was, I didn't have to do anything to make it happen. That's just the way it was. Some profound changes went on in her thinking. Well, with regard to her children, she said her youngest had chronic ear infections the year before, so many that he was scheduled for surgery. And she said after she was reading the book for a while, she took him in to keep that appointment. But she said the doctor examined his ears and said, hey, there's improvement going on here. Let's put the surgery off for a while. She said the surgery was never necessary. It never happened. He was completely healed. She said with her older boy that he had a diagnosed condition that was supposed to result in a complete loss of hearing. It never happened. And she herself had been diagnosed as asthmatic, and that went away with reading the book. She said that she learned so much. And one of the things that she learned was instead of sending evil and disease, God could be relied upon consistently for a healing. And that she's so grateful today to rely upon that, and so grateful that she can fulfill all of Jesus' commands, including the command to heal. I want to tell you about another perception of God that gets in the way of healing. It's not like God being angry and hostile, but it's equally as restrictive to healing. It's the perception that God created the universe like a big clock, wound it up, set it in motion with material laws, and then doesn't have anything to do with it anymore. Sort of the absentee God. And more or less, this was the feeling of another friend of mine who was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and he was healed while reading the book Science and Health. And I asked him one day, I said, Riley, why did you get the book Science and Health and start reading that? And he said, well, there was a lady that lived across the street that used that book for healing. And he said, as I grew up, I saw the healing effect on that family. And he said, and there was always such love that came from her. And he said, I think when I was diagnosed with TB and given 6 months to live, he said, I wanted to feel that love. And I wanted to be healed. So I went and I got the book. I said, how did it go? And he said from what little bit he had read that made sense. And so he went back and he started to read some more. And he said, everything started to change at a particular paragraph in the book Science and Health. He said things really clicked and came together when he read, the divine nature was best expressed in Christ Jesus, who threw upon mortals the truer reflection of God and lifted their lives higher than their poor thought models would allow. Thoughts which presented man as fallen, sick, sinning, and dying. And when Riley read that, he thought, yep, that's me, fallen, sick, sinning, and dying. But then it goes on to say, the Christ-like understanding of scientific being and divine healing includes a perfect principle and idea, perfect God and perfect man, as the basis of thought and demonstration. He said when he read that, he thought, now that's what Jesus was doing. He was lifting our lives higher than our poor thought models would allow. And I have a right to that. Everybody has a right to that. And he said, his vision began to clear. He put on weight. And he was able to be vital and active again. And he said he'll never forget the last day that he was in his doctor's office. He said there on a wall in the doctor's office was all the x-rays taken every week or so over the 3 months. And he said you could see on the first one the clouds on the lungs. And then with the others, fewer clouds and fewer and fewer and fewer until there were absolutely no clouds left on the lungs. Completely healed. I think whether Riley realized it or not, the reading of Science and Health was changing the emphasis of his thought from being fixated on his body to watching his thinking about the body. And as his thinking became the focus of what he was doing, and spiritual understanding was changing the action of his thought, he not only felt better, but it changed the action of those beliefs on the body, and he was healed. You know, this connection reminds me a little bit of the steering wheel and the steering column in an automobile. You know, as we're driving along in the car, you can't see the linkage between the steering column and the wheels, but you know that when I steer the car is going to go in that direction. You just know that. And no matter if there was thinking that, well, you know, this car is really heavy, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and there's a lot of horsepower here, hundreds of horsepower. You would never find yourself thinking, well, this car is so big and so powerful that I'm just going to take my hands off the steering wheel because it's going to go wherever it wants to go. You'd never do that. You'd never do that. In the same way, never, never, never take your hands off of the thoughts that steer your thought and body into health. Eddy experienced this revelation as a science. And it was a dictionary definition of science. She discovered the spiritual laws of being that could be relied upon for healing. And they came through revelation and reason and experimentation and demonstration, that there were these spiritual laws, and anybody could turn to them, learn about them, and to be healed by them. It was a science. But she also experienced this science as a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. The very Word of God fulfilling itself in modern times. As she said, sweeping down the centuries, gathering beneath its wings the sick and the sinning. She experienced it as a divine determination, fulfilling in this age its Bible promise. That's important. Because if sometimes we only look at this discovery as a set of spiritual laws that we're trying to learn more about for healing, well, what would happen if we're bumping into resistance and I feel like I don't know enough? I don't know enough. But when we begin to see that it is also the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, it brings a spiritual momentum to the healing because it's bigger than we are. It's moving by its own force and including us in its healing mission. You know, it reminds me, this spiritual momentum reminds me a little bit of surfers. Surfers. You know, when they're out there in the ocean and they're sitting on their boards, and if you don't mind, they're out there in the ocean and they're sitting on their boards. And then you see them begin to paddle. And nobody feels that they're trying to paddle hard enough themselves to launch themselves 15 to 18 miles an hour for a wild ride. No, everybody knows that they are waiting for a wave not of their own making. And then their paddling is to catch that wave. And then they stand up and the wave does the work. From then on, it's them staying with the wave. There is a spiritual momentum at work. The fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And it's embracing this age and fulfilling itself here, in this place, everywhere, all the time. And if sometimes we feel discouraged and wonder, do I know enough to be healed? Or do I know anything about it? I'm brand new. It might be better at that moment to think it's what God knows that's healing. It's what God is doing that's healing. There is a term being used in modern medical research, very interesting term. It's therapeutic encounter. A therapeutic encounter. Therapeutic, health-giving encounter. And it's being used in some research to describe what happens in the interaction between doctor or healthcare professional and patient, where no drugs are given, no surgery is performed, but there's still a positive healthcare or health effect. Therapeutic encounter. Usually it's given with regard, as I said, to a healthcare professional and a patient, but it's really an encounter between any healer and patient. That the interaction between the two so shifts the thought of the patient that it produces a profound effect on thought and body. Well, as I was reading the 91st Psalm a while back, I thought, you know, the ultimate healing or therapeutic encounter is between God and humanity, between God and humanity. No surgery, no drugs, profound shift of thought that produces a profound effect on thought and body. As I was reading the psalm, I thought, wow, what thought-changing ideas. I'm not going to read the whole psalm, but a few of the passages, I think you'll get the feeling. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. There, where? In the secret place of the Most High, there shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. Powerful, thought-shifting ideas. It seems to me that hardly anybody who is feeling alone and vulnerable, that got a glimpse that we're not alone. God is with us, and God's mighty power is fulfilling these promises. That's the ultimate therapeutic encounter. And I can't help but feel for however long this psalm has been out, 2,000 to 3,000 years, it must have been healing from day one. Powerful ideas. Also, when I was rereading that psalm, I not only got a feeling that God was the power of healing, but God was actually the environment within which the healing took place. The secret place of the Most High. It is secret from threatening kinds of things. It has the effect in human experience that when we sense this presence of God, it literally silences everything else and gives us a feeling that the only presence is God, and the only voice we're hearing is God's voice, no matter what the circumstance. As an illustration, a friend of mine was at the Pentagon on 9/11 when the plane hit. And she was on the other side of the Pentagon from where the plane hit. And she made her way through the chaos to the center courtyard where they were putting the wounded. And she said in her ministry as an Army chaplain, she went from individual to individual, and sometimes she would repeat the words of the 91st Psalm. And she said, Rob, at times I could see their lips moving with what I was saying. They knew that psalm. And she said an amazing thing would happen. During that time, they would stop fixating on their wounded bodies. They were completely oblivious to all of the yelling and the chaos going on around them. And it was like they were going into a place of healing. And I thought, yeah, the secret place of the Most High has that effect. I want to tell you about the experience of my own experience with that psalm when I was a reserve Army chaplain. I was in a supply and services battalion, and one of our companies was a trucking company. And they were up in Northern California fulfilling their 2-week duty for that year. And I got a call from them. And it was the first sergeant. And he told me that I needed to get ready to make a notification to the next of kin. Whenever a soldier is killed on active duty, even summer active duty for reservists, that somebody immediately would get over to the family and notify them. And sometimes it was the chaplain that did that. He told me that everything had been going wrong, and then what happened was there was a big semi-truck up on a ramp, and it got away from the individual that was there and rolled over a soldier and just crushed him. And the first sergeant said, "You know, chaplain, I have been in the highway patrol, and our company commander in civilian life is a police officer. We have both seen grisly accidents, but when we went running out, we heard the screaming. When we got to be about 10 feet away, we had to stop for a moment and turn away just for a second to compose ourselves. It was really bad." But I knew the first sergeant was a religious man, and he was asking me for prayer. We need prayer. And I was moved to share with him. I said, you're certainly responsible for the physical care of the troops, and you do a good job at that, and you pay attention. But we also have spiritual resources. I said, "First Sergeant, why don't you read the 91st Psalm every morning and then prayerfully embrace the soldiers with those promises?" Well, we got off the phone, and I didn't know he was going to do this, but he rounded up the whole company, and he had somebody read the 91st Psalm. You're not supposed to do that. But it calmed everybody down immediately. But for my prayer for the situation, I just felt intuitively that I needed to pay attention to the environment of what was going on. Because I just could feel or see in my mind's eye a lot of soldiers standing around looking aghast at this mess and thinking, he's a dead man. There's no way he's going to live through this. I felt intuitively I needed to deal with that. And as I was praying, I remembered a couple of statements by Jesus where he said, "My sheep hear my voice, and to another they will not come. And in another place, they know not the voice of strangers." They know not the voice of strangers. As I was thinking about that, I suddenly remembered the experience of one of my professors when I went to seminary. He said he was driving in the South, and he came around a bend, and he saw a shepherd with his flock. And he said he was a New Testament professor, and that he always had questions about the Good Shepherd, and what was Jesus trying to get across. So he said, I pulled over on the side of the road, and I went over and I talked to him, and I said, "Is it true that sheep only respond to the shepherd?" And he said, "Well, watch." And he gave a little whistle. And he said, the sheep, their heads went up, they ran right over to him. And then he moved a few feet away, and he said, and the sheep immediately ran right over to him. And he said, "Now, you do that." And so he went a few feet away, and then he tried to mimic that as best he could. He said, nothing happened. Nothing. He said, not only did they not come, they didn't even lift their heads. He said their ears didn't even twitch. It was absolutely no response. And I remembered that My sheep hear my voice, and to another they will not come. I had this feeling that he was safe in God's presence, hearing only the voice of his shepherd, who was communicating to him his safety and security in God's care. And that contending human material beliefs and all of its fears could not get inside of that presence and suffocate. He was alone with God, the secret place of the Most High. And I felt satisfied with that. Well, later I got a call, and the first sergeant told me that they had come and they had taken the young man to the emergency room. And one of our other soldiers sort of slipped in there. He wasn't supposed to be there if he came to. And after a while, he did come to. And I was told that his very first words were, "I know I'm being prayed for. I know I'm being prayed for. It helps so much. Keep it up." Well, he was up walking around in 3 days without any need for surgery. Had a profound effect on our entire unit. We had some of the most amazing conversations after that because we all knew it was the result of prayer. You know, that experience brings up, I think, an ethical question. And that's this. Whenever we find ourselves as part of a mental environment surrounding somebody in distress, whenever we find ourselves part of the mental environment surrounding somebody in distress, are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? You know, we can be strong witnesses to the fact that this individual, whoever it may be, is safe in the secret place of the Most High. And a majority of contending beliefs and fears cannot get inside of that place and impose fears and anguish. That whoever it is hears their shepherd's voice only, assuring them that they are safe in God's care. And that right in the midst of gawking crowds, fear-filled crowds, that the Christ, spiritual reality, is right there making the perfection of God's child public knowledge. Right in the midst of gawking crowds, the Christ is there making the perfection of God's child public knowledge. I know sometimes, though, we need to move fast. We need to have a prayer, a therapeutic prayer, that we can get to the issues within 5 or 6 seconds. Because sometimes we just don't have 20 minutes, a half hour, or an hour to read, calm our thought down. And so I've worked out something for myself called ARK. ARK. It reminds me of 3 points. 3 points that I try to get to very quickly in my therapeutic prayer. I mean, we all need to have a tool belt, you know, with ways that we can respond to things. One of those tools should be the quick, laser-like therapeutic prayer. Those 3 points, ARK, I've gotten from a couple of passages in Science and Health. One of them is, always begin your treatment or therapeutic prayer by allaying the fear of patience. By allaying the fear. I have found that negative material conditions require fear to be destructive. Negative material conditions require fear to be destructive. How important to deal with the fear? Always begin by allaying the fear. How do you allay the fear? Well, I think the whole lecture has been oriented towards that. Sometimes fear comes from ignorance of who we are as the spiritual image and likeness of God and the power that that has on material conditions. By knowing that reduces fear. You know, Mrs. Eddy, we gained a glimpse in the beginning that we are actually spiritual beings. Perfect. Loved by God. And it's this love that does it for me. Love casts out fear. Love reduces fear. Love removes fear. So I remember, allay the fear with this presence of divine love that holds us safe and perfect in His care. The next passage for the R and the K come from this statement. When an accident happens, you think or exclaim, "I'm hurt." Your thought is more powerful than your words, more powerful than the accident itself to make the injury real. When an accident happens, you think or exclaim, "I'm hurt." Your thought is more powerful. More powerful than the accident itself to make the injury real? Well, if that's the case, and everyone thinks that it's the relationship between accident and injury, and therefore we fixate on the material condition, but if the relationship is between thought and injury, who's watching the thought? Who's watching the thought? She goes on to say, now reverse the process, R. And then she goes on to say, declare that you're not hurt and understand the reason why. That's the R and the K. Reverse what seems to be so threatening. If thought governs, go right to the thought and reverse what appears to be threatening in thought. And then, K, know the reason why. She says, understand the reason why, but ARU doesn't work for me. ARK, know the reason why. Well, how do you reverse what appears to be threatening in the material environment? Well, you remember at the beginning, part of Mrs. Eddy's discovery was that the material view of the universe is not what it appears to be. It's the radically distorted view of the human mind. That actually underneath that view is a spiritual reality. And when that view breaks in on thought, it transforms what appears to be the threatening material condition. You remember the healing of the little boy with the double-clubbed feet, the little girl that was born blind, my friend that was diagnosed with TB and 6 months to live, the soldier in the military, the mother and her sick children. That there was a spiritual reality when glimpsed turned that all around. And know the reason why. What helps me in that area is that God is all-knowing. That God is everywhere present. That God is all-powerful. So it helps me in the knowing part, after I reverse in thought what appears to be so threatening, is to recognize something of the fact that God's here. God has all the power. God is producing good. And God not only knows this, but causes everybody to know it. So, it takes some discipline, but start to put it into practice. Don't mess around with things. Laser-like, get to the point. If you're at a playground and your child falls off of the equipment and begins to cry, now certainly you're going to rush over there and do anything that you can to take care of the demand. But in the 5 or 6 seconds it's taking you to get over there, put that child in the ark. Recognize that that child never fell out of the arms of divine love. They are not hurt. The very forces of God are holding everything in their being perfectly aligned and pain-free. And see what happens. Or if you're witnessing a terrible fight between a husband and a wife, somebody that means a lot to you, your children in their marriage fighting, or your own marriage, or somebody you care about deeply, and you don't know what to do, put that marriage in the ark. That all of their thoughts are coming from divine love. There are no irreconcilable differences. There's only one mind, and that mind is blending them together according to God's will. Or if you're watching television and you see another suicide bombing and all of the terrible effects, and you hear about the breeding grounds of hate that drive people to that, or the belief that somehow or other, if I kill people, that's God's will. Put that situation in the ark. That there are no breeding grounds of hate in divine love. There are no terrorist acts, because the Christ is dominant in human consciousness, and it causes everything good in human consciousness to detect what's wrong and to overcome it. A-R-K. A stands for allay the fear. R, K, yeah, so important. In closing, there is definitely a connection between God and health. And no matter what the popular notion about health is, the practice of spiritual healing is moving ahead in people's lives, and it's producing effects. And the practice of spiritual healing is safe in God's care. I was rereading a statement from Mary Baker Eddy, probably the person more than anyone else that's responsible for the reemergence of spiritual healing in this age. And she likens the idea of spiritual healing to a baby in this image that she presents. She says, "This is the babe we are to cherish." In other words, spiritual healing, Christian healing. "This is the babe we are to cherish, that twines its loving arms about the neck of omnipotence and calls forth infinite care from his loving heart." What an image. Here's Dad holding his child, child's arms twined around Dad's neck, Dad beaming with love for this child, nothing he wouldn't do for that child. Spiritual healing twines its loving arms about the neck of omnipotence and calls forth infinite care from his loving heart. But not just the idea of spiritual healing in the world today, but your efforts at healing and my efforts at healing, twines its loving arms about the neck of omnipotence and calls forth infinite care from his loving heart. Amen.
For more information on Christian Science healing, visit our website at www.prayerthatheals.org. The live lecture you've been watching is a gift to this community from the Christian Science churches and reading rooms in the Tri-Counties. To learn more about Prayer That Heals, you're welcome to visit our church services on Sundays and Wednesdays at any of these locations. Magazines with over 100 years of testimonies of healing and weekly Bible lessons are available at all Christian Science reading rooms. For times of services and reading room hours, or to watch other broadcasts in the speaker series, visit www.prayerthatheals.org.